basically kind of cleanse the South kind of because they are Muslim or Islamic, and that was their ground, but also just to kind of take control of the whole country.
The South, there was an organization called the SPLA that went to the government in Khartoum at the time and wanted to institute some reforms in the government that included making it not a Muslim state, and the government didn't want that, and so there was U.S. support for the government in Khartoum, and there was a war that then began between North-South on that issue.
So 20-year civil war, we can correct that a bit. What the basics is for what we're doing is there's a 20-year, as the professor talked about, 20-year war between 2 decades between Khartoum, and I'm going to draw the worst map ever, I promise, of Sudan. So let's look at this geographically. It looks like a big circle. It's terrible. I can't draw. So Khartoum, which we talk about, government of Sudan is referred to as Khartoum. Geographically in the country, they're basically here. And when you hear north or south, north literally pretty much refers to this, some surrounding areas, and then maybe a couple of cities, Port Sudan on the east, right? Some strategic points, but that's where their power is. Great. Darfur, we take a big chunk out of the west. Talk about Darfur here. I'm totally off, but we're talking about just regions here. Geographically, we're looking at the south. Let's say we're going here, and we're talking about this big piece in the south, right? So you've got a war between Khartoum's armies, rebel groups in the south. Terrible. I mean, the atrocities. There was a big movement here with the religious right, for Christians being persecuted. This terrible thing lasting 20 years. And one of the major problems and facilitators of this war was oil at the time. So looking at oil geographically, oil is found, and as Eric pointed out, there is no, oil for the purpose of Sudan, the purpose of its interest in Sudan is in the southern part of the country, largely. And then what happens is you got Port Sudan, it's drilled here, exported there, basically. But you have all these, the major bulk of oil fields are in the south. And you had a situation that developed between the North-South and the North-South Civil War was you had companies that were taking oil out of this part of the region, of the country, in the south. And then they were, obviously, the government, Khartoum was government in power, and revenue, giving government money for taking that oil. But you can see in a regional war, they're in a strategic location. So what were they doing with that? And you'll hear oil companies to no end say, we don't get involved in politics. The country, even in the case of Schlumberger, which is an oil company we're talking about, started in France, and they have a lot of interest oil operations in Sudan. Their response thus far to Darfur has been, Sudan has oil, and we're in the oil business. Well, they were going a step further at the time, and even largely today, and Darfur was, specifically, we'll talk about this company, Talisman Oil, a Canadian oil firm that had a big interest, big block of oil control in southern Sudan. They were actually allowing Khartoum to use their facilities as launching points for attacks in the south. So aside from just giving money and basically funding Sunnis military at the time, they were actually going a step further, purchasing government to, security, government military to secure and attack villages and innocent people in the south, refueling government aircrafts, providing military equipment. Sudan, as Professor Reeve mentioned, is an extremely debt-ridden country. So what happened was, and we'll get into this in just a second a bit more, but Talisman Oil, there was huge pressure, and Professor Reeve was one of the leaders of this movement, on Talisman Oil. There was a divestment movement for Talisman Oil. What happened was, and all these investors started taking their money out, and it was spearheaded by a number of crazy different groups all over the place. But what happens is, in the investment world, as I'm sure most of us know, is if supply remains the same and demand goes down from people selling stock, price goes down. So the share price of Talisman dropped like crazy. And the message that it sent is, because of what's going on and what you're doing in Sudan, we're going to make it unprofitable for you. So what Talisman did was, in 2000, they actually left the country. They took their operations out. They were followed by 2 other companies, big oil interest, and soon thereafter, Sudan went back to the table and we got the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. So 2 examples. Those are a simplified version of both examples, but just so we know that we've established precedent. That economic pressure has been used in the past in Sudan and it's been effective. Okay, so what's the role? We talked about oil. Ignore this for a minute. Oil extraction began in Sudan about a decade ago. So let's look what happened. You have a debt-ridden country. Obviously, if they're in the huge debt we talk about, there's no infrastructure building, right? So you have a point where infrastructure. We'll look at this chart. We'll look at infrastructure over time, development in the country, and mostly we're talking about the marginalized regions, so regions outside that tiny little circle that I drew. What's happening? So obviously, before any oil, you don't have. I mean, you've got various industries, but it's a poor country. Infrastructure is low. There's a lot of debt, so we're looking here for infrastructure. Now, about a decade ago, oil started being extracted from Sudan. It's now huge. It's one of China's main sources. It's their largest country in Africa, where they get most of the oil from Africa. A lot of oil coming out of Sudan, starting with a decade ago. So you have this influx of foreign direct investment, this influx of investment in the oil industry in Sudan. So you think at some point, development, I mean, you've got all this money coming, development in the country and infrastructure building should go up. So what happened? I mean, I'm sure you can guess. Obviously it wouldn't make much sense while we're here, but it didn't go up. Probably, if anything, went down. So even to this day, development money in the country comes from international donors. So what went up? I mean, you've got all this money coming in starting a decade ago. Where's it being spent? So if you look at a chart, and this is, correlation, but what happened? I mean, can anyone guess what happened with military expenditures at that time? Skyrocketed. Starting with a decade ago. I mean, you just got, nuts. It went nuts. And now the latest figure is, and this is from a recent New York Times expose, as much as 80% of oil revenue in Sudan goes directly to Khartoum military expenditures. So, what have we identified? Genocidal government. When have they changed their behavior? Economic pressure. We've got an industry, a specific industry in Sudan, oil, where most of the investment is, and then energy and other industries as they relate to oil. And almost all of that money, or a good percentage of it, is going to oil revenue. So we're going to fit into it. Okay. So the question is, what is divestment? And that was a question that came up. So where do we plan? We put your name on the board, all your universities. The way universities and cities and states make money, the way they pay the retirement benefits, so you'll see there's public employees, state teachers, is through they take money that either comes from contributions from members or recipients of the retirement, that come from taxes in some states, foundations for donations in schools, and the way they get more money is through investment. So you got the actors, which are us, and our retirement funds and our pensions, and then we take that money and go to have more returns and increase it. It goes into investment portfolios, right? So basically, there's stock markets all over the world. You've all heard of the stock markets. There's different types of equity markets, but all these different ways to invest your money in international companies, right? I mean, there's a New York Stock Exchange, there's a London Stock Exchange, there's actually a Khartoum Stock Exchange. So basically companies, the way they come on, it's not just so we could give them our money, it's the way that they have access. So these companies, they need money to operate, and they get which is called capital, and these are called capital markets. So you have access to capital markets, right? And you need that. So basically a marketplace, right? It's a swap meet, so a place where people from around the world can come and bring their money. Because you can't just go to Walmart and say, here's 100, you invest it through a stock exchange and buy shares, as we all know. So it's a trading place. So these schools and cities have portfolios that have all these different companies in it from all over the place, right? And then the question is, and then we'll get into this, is a lot of these are companies that are kind of suspect companies, and we'll get into what a suspect company is in a minute, but these bad players, which we call the worst offenders, they have holdings in companies, specific companies through these portfolios. And divestment is simply removing the investment in those specific companies for a specific reason, which is the genocide in Sudan. So that's the simplified version. It's much more complicated. I don't even understand it all. I feel like I understand enough to know more than the person I'm trying to convince, but that's the basic. We'll get into it like that. So, what are the problems, right? Well, first of all, what's the goal of that, I guess? If we're talking about a company, let's say Talison Oil, right, like we mentioned in Sudan at the time, the goal was to basically, let them know, send the message that their investments in the country aren't going to, that they can't, we're not going to fund, let them make a profit we're going to make it unprofitable to do business with genocide, basically is the message. And it was effective there, and we're starting to see the effects now. What are some of the problems, though? So what are we doing? Basically, we're taking investment out of the country, right? And we're removing investment from a debt-ridden country that has no infrastructure. So what are some of the problems associated with that? Next